Ever since man first took seaborne vessels out onto the oceans and seas that surround us, they have returned with tales of violent storms, sea monsters, and ghost ships. The open waters captured mankind's imagination in ways comparable to the way outer space has today. The ocean represented the great unknown, but perhaps mankind's most potent fear is just that, fear of the unknown. Perhaps the greatest mystery of all time is that of the Mary Celeste. Yet there is another, arguably just as curious event that took place mere decades ago, just after the end of the Second World War. It is a story filled with intrigue, terror, and death in the tropical waters of Southeast Asia. This is a tale of the Ourang Maydon. The Straits of Malacca is a narrow 550-mile stretch of water that lies between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra. As the main shipping channel between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, it is one of the most important shipping lanes in the world and is named after the Malacca Sultanate that ruled over the archipelago between the 15th and 16th centuries. In late 1947, and even into early 1948, the number of ships sailing through the straits began to pick up a series of unusual radio messages, divided into two separate parts, sandwiching a cluster of indecipherable Morse code. The message read as follows: "All officers are dead, including captain, lying in chart room and bridge. Possible that whole crew dead. I die." Despite their best efforts, radio operators found it impossible to determine the exact geographic source of the mysterious transmission. Nothing else was transmitted, just those two clipped, but haunting sentences. Two American merchant vessels picked up on the cryptic radio messages and were very compelled to investigate. The sailors feel a certain solidarity for their own, but the mysterious messages must have piqued their curiosity even more and driven them to try to uncover the truth. With the help of British and Dutch listening posts, the coordinates of the vessel thought to be transmitting were triangulated. After some deduction, it was determined that there was only one ship that the messages could be transmitted from, a Dutch freighter named the SS Ourang Maydon. One of the American merchant ships, by the name of Silver Star, was then ordered to investigate the coordinates in question. Obviously, given the nature of the distress call, the captain of the Silver Star wasted no time in setting a new heading and steaming towards the potential rescue site. It took several hours of hard sailing, but eventually, the lookout on board the Silver Star spotted a stricken ship in the distance. It was indeed the Ourang Maydon. No signs of life could be discerned, and as the rescue ship pulled up alongside her, the crew screamed and bellowed with all their might, trying to communicate with the now unseen crew. After no response was received, it was evident that a boarding party would have to be organized in order to properly search the ship for survivors. From the very moment that the boarding party climbed onto the deck, it was clear that something was horribly wrong. It was soaked with blood. The entire upper deck of the ship more resembled a slaughterhouse than a sailing vessel. The broken dead bodies of the Dutch crew were strewn about the scene, their faces frozen into death masks of pure terror, their arms horribly contorted as if they'd spent their final moments trying to fight off some mystery assailant. Even the ship's dog was unable to escape the carnage, still snarling in death at whatever had massacred its masters. Just as the emergency transmission had stated, the captain was also dead, lying face down in his private quarters in a pool of his own blood and innards. He too had an expression of complete and utter terror etched into his lifeless features. almost as if he had witnessed to some kind of unspeakable horror in his final moments of life. What little remained of the bridge officers and engineers was found in the wheelhouse and chart room. They had been completely torn apart and were actually only identifiable by the insignia on their gore-soaked, shredded clothing. The ship's radio operator, the very same crew member who had sent out the distress call in the first place, was still sitting at his station, radio handset still in his grip. He was no exception. The same terrified expression preserved in the rigor mortis that had set in not long after death. As the boarding party searched the gore-drenched ghost ship, they began to notice several things that immediately struck them as odd or strange. Firstly, during the time of the Ourang Maydon was found, it was summer in the southern hemisphere. Outside temperatures were in the excess of 100 degrees. Yet, members of the boarding party noted that they had felt an ominous chill emanating from somewhere aboard the ship. Additionally, the condition of the corpses was scarily unusual, as they were decaying much faster than was expected, even in the tropics. What's more, aside from the mess made of the bridge officers, many of the victims displayed no visible wounds, nor had the ship suffered any damage associated with the hostile boarding party. The Straits of Malacca are well known for Malay pirates, the attack in small, fast speedboats equipped with grappling hooks and grenades. But there was no indication that piracy was to blame, since it is common practice for hostages and cargo to be taken. Yet, nothing was missing or out of place. When the boarding party completed their search and returned to the Silver Star, the captain made the quick decision to tow the Ourang Maydon back to port for salvaging purposes. But it was only once the ship had been tethered together that smoke was discovered below the deck. This confused the men who had been part of the boarding party, since they had searched the ship intensely, and no sign of fire was ever discovered. The crew of the Silver Star rushed into action, quickly severing the rope, keeping the two ships attached before potential disaster could strike. Just minutes after, the Maydon exploded with enough force to lift it clean out of the water before finally sinking to the bottom of the sea. The first official accounts of the incident were recorded by the United States Coast Guard in May 1952, in addition to the witness testimony, which detailed the sorry state of the crew themselves. The published account added that they were all found with their faces frozen, upturned to the sun, staring as if in fear. The mouths were gaping open, and all eyes staring. But many naval historians argue that the Ourang Maydon never even existed, and officially speaking, it didn't. At the same time, the Maydon was supposed to have suffered its terrible fate in the Straits of Malacca. The Silver Star was operating under another name entirely, the Santa Juana. The Grace Line Shipping Company had bought rights to the ship and renamed it way after the late 1940s. In contrast, there are some that insist that the Maydon was a real ship, and insist that she was registered in Sumatra. Sumatra was a Dutch colony that formed part of what was known as the Dutch East Indies. In Indonesian, Ourang means man, and Maydon is the largest city on the island of Sumatra. Hence the name literally means man from Maydon. However, no records have ever been produced to prove this claim. Even the UK-based Lloyd's Shipping Registers and the Dictionary of Disasters at Sea, 1824 to 1962, has found no mention of the Ourang Maydon. But there may be a rational, albeit horrific, explanation for the lack of official records. A strong theory attempts to explain the bizarre demise of the crew that's related to biological weapons designed and manufactured by Japanese scientists, led by a Japanese bacteriologist. Ishii was the head of Unit 731, a secret Japanese military facility that performed insidious experiments, mostly on Chinese test subjects. These tests were even more sinister and insidious than that of the Nazi experiments at Auschwitz, and included creating dangerous biological and chemical weapons to help Japan eliminate its enemies. It is believed that in the aftermath of the war, these biological and chemical weapons had to be shipped back to the U.S. to be studied. However, some high-tier government agent must have decided that these were best shipped secretively on civilian vessels in order to avoid possible interception by the Soviet KGB. There could have been an accident involving their secretive cargo, unleashing the full force of the nightmarish arsenal on the unsuspecting crew. The truth behind what really happened has been buried since the 50s, and it is entirely possible that we'll never ever know the real story, or if the ship ever existed in the first place. But it is not the first time or the first maritime mystery to capture the public's imagination, and doubtless it will not be the last. There are, however, other theories that surround the disappearance and the death of the entire crew. For example, some even speculate that unknown biological life forms had boarded the ship secretively and decimated the entire crew, which would explain the blood and guts. But then how come none of the bodies were ever moved? Why were they just killed and not appeared to be eaten on? There are many questions and not enough answers. If that was also the case, then why is it that none of the victims appear to show any wounds? But there's other speculation along with this theory that much of the accounts of finding the bodies is partially misconstrued, and that they actually show deep wounds of being torn open and partially eaten, which would support evidence of an unknown biological life form entering onto the boat from the sea, killing and devouring all of the entirety of the crew. In addition to this, there were apparently details left out. Tracks that led from the waters to the ship, and from the ship back, and even a mysterious slime or ooze-like substance found on the floor of the ship, which would further support that something came out of the water and climbed onto the ship and killed the entire crew, to only go back. But then the question again arises, why didn't it, or they, take the bodies? It's believed by some that because of this, the details of the story had to be changed, further pushing it in the direction of a Japanese bioweapon being unleashed. But once that plan failed and the ship ended up sinking, that all decided to be scrapped anyway, which could explain why all of it is now gone and disappeared, why you can't find any traces of it. They really had to cover their butt. Either way you look at it, be a Japanese bioweapon or some horrific biological life form from the sea coming up onto the ship and devouring and killing all the crew, there's something more going on than we can ever imagine. Something that makes me personally terrified to ever step foot out on sea.